So I think we'll go ahead and get started. Bonjour, welcome. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Renee Bew. I'm the Programming and Outreach Coordinator. I didn't say anything yet. Why are you clapping? Thank you. But thank you for coming this evening. I think you're really going to enjoy this program, the discussion with Ben about his book. Before we officially get really into it and started, I am going to read a land acknowledgement statement that the Allies of Native Nations, which is a Rock County organization, a subcommittee of the Diversity Action Team, uses for all of our meetings and our programs. We would like to recognize that we are meeting on the ancestral lands of Native nations. In Wisconsin, there are 11 federally recognized Native American sovereign nations and one seeking to regain federal recognition. We acknowledge these indigenous communities who have stewarded this land through the generations and pay respect to their elders, past and present. So a couple of housekeeping things. We will be recording the program tonight, and it will be available soon after tonight on JATV's YouTube channel and Hedberg Public Library's YouTube channel. So if you have friends or family that missed coming tonight, you can direct them to YouTube to find it. Also, as I said, Ben will be speaking without a mask per City of Janesville policy. Presenters may speak without a mask. They just need to be 6 feet away, and we have him very well placed so that he is out of 6 foot range with everyone. However, if during the program you feel uncomfortable, you want to be farther away from your neighbors, please feel free to move your chair over to the side. We want you to be comfortable while you're here. So the other thing I want to let you know is Ben did bring some of his books with him this evening. So after we are done, if you are interested in buying a book and having Ben sign it, we'll be doing that after the program is done. Also, we are taking questions at the end. So I will have these notepads and pens. If you think of a question, raise your hand and I will bring you one and you can write your question down, because it's likely that people will have similar questions, and then I will try to combine some of the questions just to save time. Let's see. I think that's it for all the housekeeping. Oh, and the restrooms are right out the door and to the right. If you need to do that, feel free at any time. All right. Ben Strand hails from the uplands of southwestern Wisconsin. He received his education while serving as a busboy at the Tim Supper Club in Dodgeville, Wisconsin, and the Old Mexico Grill in Santa Fe, New Mexico. With degrees from the University of Wisconsin and an MFA from Goddard College in Vermont, he has a long-standing commitment to the Wisconsin idea and the Green Mountain ideal. He currently makes his home with his family and school-aged children in the Driftless region of Wisconsin. I present to you Ben Strand.
Hey, thanks, Renee. Thanks so much.
You are very welcome.
Can everyone hear me all right in the back? And again, thanks. I am vaccinated. I did take my mask off. And just wanted to thank Renee for her hospitality and the Friends of the Hedberg. You're so lucky to have such a wonderful facility and resource in Janesville. And thank you for inviting me to talk a little bit today about the Blackhawk War and my own journey in learning about the Blackhawk War, and hopefully trying to share a little bit about the resources and stories and great museums and historic sites throughout our region that touch upon the Blackhawk War. I'll note I wanted to start with kind of my big takeaway, which I learned and took away from this experience. I grew up, as Renee said, in Dodgeville, Wisconsin, a small town about an hour west of Madison that is named after Henry Dodge, the first territorial governor of Wisconsin. And even though I grew up in a town named after Henry Dodge, and the two swimming holes in our area is Governor Dodge State Park, and then the Blackhawk Park over in Highland, Wisconsin. But no one ever said, hey, you know, the reason why we named these lakes are because of the Black Hawk War and the Winnebago and Sauk and Fox and Kickapoo used to be in this area. You know, I grew up watching Rawhide and, you know, reading Frontier Dan, but it really wasn't shared with us, you know, the important Native American history of our neck of the woods. So I wanted to point out, Renee was right too, that there's 11 federally recognized tribes in Wisconsin, but there's a few tribes who used to be here who are no longer in Wisconsin, including the Kickapoo, and the two that I'll talk the most about are the Sauk and Fox. So the very first triangle, or actually on your right, the one in Iowa, the closest to us, probably, you know, maybe 4-hour drive or so away from here, is the home of the Meskwaki, the Sauk and Fox tribe of the Mississippi and Iowa. And they have a very interesting history that after the Black Hawk War, they were pushed out of their home around the Quad Cities and their territory, which included, you know, parts of the Rock River. They kept coming back. They were forced into Kansas, the second triangle, but a group kept coming back over and over again and were really persistent. And they're noted as not being a reservation. They actually bought their own land. So starting in 1857, the governor of Iowa actually allowed it. They had to pass a state law that said that Native Americans could resettle in Iowa. So since that beginning, they now have over 800 acres of the Meskwaki in Iowa. They've been having a powwow since 1915 that's open to the community. It's a great community. They also have a casino, a historic center, library, and just recently, a couple years ago, they reintroduced a herd of buffalo to the area. Then the next triangle is the Nemahahachi, or the Sauk and Fox Nation of Missouri, in Kansas and Nebraska. And that's probably the smallest of the three communities, the Sauk and Fox. And it's the main group that was pushed out of their original home around Saukenuk. That's where they were first forced out of. And then the largest in Oklahoma is where they were forced again. A few stayed in Kansas, similar to how a few stayed in Iowa. A few really wanted to stay in the area. And the Kickapoo Reservation is just north of them. But Oklahoma has the largest home of the Sauk and Fox, the Saukewaki, the Sauk and Fox Nation of Oklahoma. And interestingly, I'll also point out that if you are lucky enough to go visit the Meskwaki in Tama, about 10-12 miles north of the city is a plaque that notes the land that Abraham Lincoln was given for his service in the militia. He actually was given 40 acres. He never visited the area, and it was his family sold it off in 1867 after Lincoln had been assassinated. For $100, they sold those 40 acres of land. But it's just interesting that here Lincoln served in the militia. Part of his reward was this land that in that area the Meskwaki were able to slowly rebuild their community. This is the road sign, this old abandoned road sign outside of Cold Spring. You may have been through there, kind of the back roads to Fort Atkinson, that really started me on this exploration of learning more about the Black Hawk War. This sign isn't there anymore. It fell down and disintegrated, and they've put up a new one, and they changed the language a little bit. But this is the sign that really started me on my journey, and I didn't have a book in mind when I began whatsoever. But I just started a lot of questions for me, and I started reading and touring a lot of the museums in the area on weekends and vacations. And I wanted to mention that how important libraries and research libraries were in this process. And if I could leave you with anything, our three resources, if you want to, there's many more resources, but these are the three that really had probably the most profound impact on this work. The first was Blackhawk's own autobiography. In 1833, a year after the war, Blackhawk was defeated, and the British band was really decimated by the battles. He sat down and worked with a couple people in the Quad Cities to write his own autobiography. It's still in print by the Illinois University Press, or if you even Google it on Google Books or Hothy Trust, you can read it page by page. There's quite a few different versions of the different printings it's gone through. But it's really great. It's a first-person account of his early life, the history of his community, a little bit definitely of the conflict and afterwards. But I think it's really a truly American work that people should enjoy. The next is Wabun, or the Early Days of the Northwest by Juliet Kinsey. Now it just happened that in 1832, Juliet Kinsey and her husband, John Kinsey, were in Portage building the first Indian agency house in Wisconsin. So they were working more with the Ho-Chunk or Winnebago Nation and trying to keep them out of the conflict during the Black Hawk War. But it relates her travels through this area, almost getting lost and frozen during a winter when there were no roads, really no buildings, a few Native American communities that they relied on heavily. But it's really just an amazing written account of some of the first impressions European and Americans had of this area. The other is the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper. This was printed down south, but it was concurrent with the Black Hawk War, and they were trying to have the voices of the Native American peoples from different communities shared throughout the nation. Now, there are definitely, Americans, Europeans helping translate and helping the paper, but I think it is a really good, important account of the dissonance, the back and forth arguments as to giving Native Americans more rights. And that is being digitized too by the Library of Congress. So you can go Google Cherokee Phoenix newspaper and have some great resources. The other, the source I relied on libraries for were old newspapers. There were two great newspapers in Galena, Illinois at the time that were printing by 1827, 1828. And you can see why I now need reading glasses, because while the information is wonderful, the old microfiche machines, and when they moved the newspaper to microfiche, everything got reversed. And after a while, it can really make you be seen double or triple. But these newspapers were great, and it's a warning to people too when you think you can go online and just Google it or look up in a search engine. There's so many great material and stories and resources like this that are just buried. 1832, so yeah, almost 200 years ago. But this resource was passed over by the Library of Congress to digitize. So maybe in 100 years they'll get to digitizing it. But there's a lot of great resources out here. And this isn't even, this is still just kind of scratching the surface of other papers and accounts that could be hidden out there that, is why, we can't just rely on Google and the intranets. I just want to share two quick early pieces that I thought you might enjoy. The first one is from the Miners Journal, so this is 1828 in Galena. Are there any folks here from Illinois? Oh, good for you. So don't be offended, but I just love this description of Galena. So this was a letter to the editor, in the 1828 Miners Journal about the state of Galena, which is a really beautiful, cute tourist town now. So this is the letter. I have had occasion of late to pass frequently through the town of Galena. My olfactory nerves were scarcely more affected than they were from the exhalations which arose from the dead rats, the old pork, the beef, the bacon, the offal. Now, offal, O-F-F-A-L, if there's anyone who doesn't know, is human excrement, which lay in every part of our streets. Situated as we are without a police, every good citizen ought to surely feel it to be their duty to observe the necessary degree of cleanliness. So that was written by Toby Scratcham in a letter to the editor in the Miners Journal, July 1828. And to sort of put that against a description of Julia Kinsey in Waubun, where she writes about a wonderful Potawatomi village on the lake, on the shores of Lake Geneva. Now, I know that all are probably familiar with Lake Geneva, sort of the Beverly Hills of Wisconsin Dells. If you have had good luck on the Powerball ticket, you may have seen the Driehaus Mansion is now for sale for $36 million. But there's an old story of how around the lake it was a really important Native American trail. And to this day, the early settlers of Lake Geneva were smart enough to keep public access around the 26 miles of Lake Geneva. You can still walk around today and see the mansions and all the nice communities. So this is her description of a Potawatomi village right on the shores of Lake Geneva. We descended a long, sloping knoll, and by a sudden turn came full in view of the beautiful sheet of water. Bold, swelling hills jutted forward into the blue expanse or retreated slightly to afford a green, level nook as a resting place for the foot of man. On the nearer shore stretched a bright, gravelly beach through which coursed here and there a pure, sparkling rivulet of water joined the larger lake. On a rising ground at the foot of one of the bold bluffs in the middle distance, a collection of neat wigwams formed, with their surrounding gardens, no unpleasant feature in this picture. So that was Julia Kinsey. And then as I dug more and more into the history of Blackhawk and the Blackhawk War, I couldn't help but notice just how ubiquitous his name is in our culture, that he's really been adopted by so many corporations and schools and teams throughout, especially the Midwest. So the Blackhawk War takes place in 1832. By 1857, Elizabeth Farnsworth Mears had a wildly successful play, Blackhawk, or Lily of the Valley, was its subtitle, in Madison. It ran for 3 weeks straight and featured white actors and actresses who dressed themselves up in headdresses and retold the story of Blackhawk. Even more surprisingly, by 1862, the Union Navy had a ship named after Blackhawk. So within the lifetimes of soldiers who fought against Blackhawk, there was a ship in the Mississippi Regiment that actually fought against Confederate soldiers in the Blackhawk War. In many ways, Blackhawk's image has been used to sell popcorn shellers, golf clubs, socket wrenches, piston grips, bicycles, boots, fly swatters, restaurants, banks, technical colleges, hotels, motels, ginger ale, ginger beer, a film production company, fishing hooks, fishing reels, military helicopters, cars, plays, books, and even travel guides. I think he's also the only person to have 2 names still named after him for professional sports. The Chicago Blackhawks, the hockey team in Chicago, of course, since 1926, but the Atlanta Hawks, the NBA team, founded in 1946 as the Tri-City Blackhawks in today's Quad Cities. So it was really interesting going along that here I was finding some of these great resources, very old references, very new references, and it was really, a time where just worlds were colliding, that by 1830, by a very narrow margin, the Senate voted 28 in favor and 19 against, and the House of Representatives voted 101 for and 97 against for the Indian Removal Act to pass. I found a lot of great people, having statements against it, warning us against this act. Of course, at the time, only white men were able to vote. But it did pass, and while there were treaties that were contested, it was really the 1830 Act really kept things moving and forced the issue with the sock and fox. I also like to point out a little bit of the slavery connections, which was a very big surprise to me in Wisconsin. Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, slavery was never legal, but in the early days of the Northwest Territory, there were a handful of slave owners in what is today Wisconsin. Henry Dodge, the man who the town I grew up in, Dodgeville, is named after, Henry Gratiot, and a handful of other owners were able to operate with slave labor in their mines due to the lack of any legal or judicial system on the frontier. In the 1830 census, there were 22 male slaves and 10 female slaves in the Michigan Territory. And Henry Dodge's household included 5 slaves and 4 free-colored individuals. UW-Platteville has been working on researching this area. They're right in the center of the driftless area and where mining was such an important early industry. And they've been looking, and they found the names of Dodge's slaves. Their names were Lear, Joe, Tom, Jim, and Toby. And it's really an interesting lost, part of our history. We're also in Galena, pretty frequently you would find runaway slave notices for people trying to hunt down and offering rewards for people to capture and hold on to slaves that had absconded from their farms in the South. The other interesting piece is that in Fort Crawford in Prairie du Chien, there were just a handful of Union officers who had slaves serving them while they were in the U.S. military. They would even get a stipend. They would get their regular pay, but because they brought another person, their manservant or slave to help, they would also get a higher pay wage because they were bringing that person to help with them. One of those officers was courting Sarah Knox Taylor, a young woman in the frontier in Prairie du Chien. Her father was Zachary Taylor, the commander of the fort, who would go on to become our 12th president, a Whig party member who was close with Abraham Lincoln. So I wanted to share a little bit of a love letter that this officer who had his slave with him in Prairie du Chien wrote to Sarah Knox Taylor. He starts, "'Tis strange how superstitious intense feelings render us, stranger still what aids chance, sometimes to support our superstition. Dreams, my dear Sarah, we will agree, are our weakest thoughts, and yet by dreams have I been almost crazed, for they were of you, and the sleeping imagination painted you not such as I left you." That was a letter from Jefferson Phineas Davis, the future president of the Confederacy. But during the Blackhawk War, he was serving as an officer at Fort Crawford. So a lot of interesting things going on right when the Blackhawk War started. The other, which I'll mention just because the images are so amazing and we're so lucky to have, is that an Eastern painter, George Catlin, had asked for special permission to come to the area and to start, documenting Native American tribes and painting figures and scenes And his wonderful collection is now free online at the Smithsonian Institute of Art. You can go on, look up George Catlin. There's probably maybe 200 paintings that he did. And it's really interesting to to this story specifically, because Catlin, on the cover of the book, that is one of Catlin's paintings. He paints some of the major figures from the Blackhawk War. So the figure on the left is Keokuk, a Sauk and Fox chief, and then his wife, who is the next figure. And not many Native American women were painted. So this is a really nice representation of her. And I'll note here that Keokuk was really a rival of Blackhawks. So Blackhawk was the elder military leader who, wanted to really confront the American forces and make a claim for their former land. While Keokuk was the leader, and majority of Sac and Fox followed him to Kansas. So it's striking that each of them had these divergent opinions, and each of them had two different paths to go. But Catlin was able to paint both of them, and at the end, in a way, brought them together as well. Here's two more paintings by Catlin. The figure on your left is Iowa, one of the warriors that went with Blackhawk. And the figure on the right in the white is White Cloud the Prophet. And Prophetstown, Illinois is named after his village. He was one of the figures who promised Blackhawk support and said, you can come stay with us. But the hard thing was he was sort of outside any one tribal. He was sort of his own amalgam of people who lived in his community. There are about 200 to 300 people who lived at Prophetstown, but because they were outside of a larger tribe or confederacy, the Union didn't even really try to make a treaty or a separate deal with them. They just sort of ignored their rights. This is another of Catlin's wonderful paintings, and I'll just read the description. This is on the shores of the Mississippi River by Prairie du Chien, present-day Prairie du Chien and French Island, where the great Historical Society has a really wonderful museum and tour, and they're building more and more. A lot of communities will come and do reenacting there, and it's just an amazing historic site. So this is what Catlin wrote of what this painting displays. This afternoon they had a great game of lacrosse on the prairie between the Sioux, the Dakotas, on one side, and the Fox and the Sauk on the other. The ball is made of a hard substance and covered with leather. The cross sticks are round with a network of nets with handles 3 feet long. The parties being ready and the bets agreed upon, sometimes the amount in the thousands of dollars. The goals are set up on the prairie at a distance of half a mile. The ball is thrown up in the middle, and each party strives to drive it to the opposite goal. When either party gains the first rubber, which is driving quick around the post, the ball is again taken to the center, and the ground changed and the contest renewed, and this is continued until one side gains 4 times, which decides the bet. It is an interesting sight to see 200 or 300 naked Native Americans contending on the plain, and who shall bear off the palm of victory, as he who drives the ball is much shouted at by his companions. So this is a little bit before the Black Hawk War. And after the Black Hawk War, Catlin takes his paintings back east and has expositions, sort of like P.T. Barnum. He takes back hides and relics and materials from the Native Americans that he's gathered, and these paintings. And people don't believe him. They're like, these can't really be the people and what they look like. So in 1837, Caitlin recruits Keokuk and Blackhawk and about 20 other members of the Sac and Fox and Iowa tribe and takes them out east. And, they would charge admission. They would go through, have a stage probably much nicer than this. And Caitlin would go through each portrait, and Blackhawk was sitting there, and now Keokuk was standing there to really show that, these people are real. This is how they look and how they live. So it's just interesting that that process of trying to share what these other cultures are and what they're like. And when Blackhawk, after the war, he's imprisoned in Fortress Monroe out east and toured around New York and Baltimore, sort of showing him off as a loser in the conflict. But the public really was enamored with him and his sons and all of the members of his community. And he must have enjoyed it enough that 5 years later he goes back with Caitlin and with part of his tour. So now this is a picture from a series of pictures from the Hauberg Museum in the Quad Cities. So the Quad Cities and Rock Island especially was the main central home of the Sac and Fox. Accounts list that up to 6,000 tribal members lived there in the 1830s. There's an 1804 treaty which was much maligned, which they contested for decades, that they would give up their homeland and move west of the Mississippi. They were eventually forced out of Saukenock, and in 1831, Blackhawk and a small contingent went back over the river and tried to retake their farmland and home at Saukenock. It was definitely a smaller faction that they called the British Band. Now, in the 1700s, the Fox and Sauk fought with the British against the French. The French Native American wars against the Fox were really horrific. The French not only were merciless, they also imprisoned and enslaved a lot of captives from the Fox communities. So because of that long history of working with the British, now that Blackhawk was once again coming across to the east of the Mississippi, they dubbed it the British Band. In 1831, General Gaines is the leader of the fort and in today's Quad Cities, and has a big show-up force. He shoots off cannons. He brings up 2,100 troops from St. Louis because he heard that Blackhawk is going to try something like this, and they pretty much stand down. The Blackhawk and a lot of the people who came with him see the show of force, and they decide, the Americans are serious. We don't want to be attacked. We're going to go and try it again in Kansas. Well, it's a terrible year in Kansas. The crops failed. And Blackhawk relates in his autobiography how it was really, the women were really the ones behind him, because for generations they had sowed the farm fields in the riparian hills of Rock Island. They were the ones who had, built the ground, it takes decades, generations to get the soil right for farming. Their crops were corn and squash and beans, and they were just devastated that now they had to leave that all. So in 1832, General Gaines is no longer the commander. It's now General Atkinson, who are friends in Fort Atkinson. Their town is named after. But Atkinson was a little slow to get a force together. And before he could really, stop Blackhawk as he's coming up the river and try to, force them to stop and have a big display of force or threats, Blackhawk keeps going up the Rock River and passes Rock Island. And they keep trying to negotiate. A lot of couriers go back and forth, and Blackhawk, says openly, I'm not their leader. We're just all going to see White Cloud and Prophetstown. We just are going to make a new homeland with our friends. We don't want to fight. So Atkinson starts following up the Rock River, and they have a call out for militia. So if you were, a down on your luck farmer or wanted some adventure, like Abraham Lincoln, who's just hanging out in Sangamon County, Illinois, you could sign up for the militia. Now, as they were in the Rock River, Atkinson had a terrible time with his supplies and with his keeping, the morale up, and he was going so much slower than the Illinois militia that he allowed Isaiah Stillman, one of the mid-level leaders of the Illinois militia, to go ahead. So they got to Dixon, and unfortunately, they got into a conflict with Blackhawk's troops. Blackhawk had only a few hundred troops then in that part just north of Dixon. And I'll just read a brief account from one of the Illinois militia people at Stillman's Run. After a pursuit of about 5 miles up Rock River, we overtook the fugitives and found them armed with bows and arrows, spears and rifles. We recognized a red flag and ordered them to surrender. This order being disobeyed, we fired and brought down 3 Indians and 1 pony. The Indians now rallied to the number of about 30 and moved towards us with moderation. We then fell back across the ravine till we were reinforced. The Indians were now seen by the glimmering moonlight on 3 sides like swarms of summer insects. Our lines never again formed. Some companies formed and fired. Others were thrown into confusion by the retreat of others. Our camp then resounded as though 500 men were under the torture of the tomahawk and scalping knife. I heard orders given by some of the men to kill those damned Indian prisoners. It is true there was perhaps 1 case of inebriation. On our march about 10 miles from Sycamore, it was found that the baggage wagon was too heavy. So 1 barrel of whiskey was therefore headed, and we all filled our canteens. General Atkinson noted that, quote, I regret that General Stillman was sent to reconnoiter the Indians before my arrival. It has not only encouraged the Indians, but closed the door against settling the difficulty without bloodshed. The routing of about 300 militia by a few dozen members of the British band escalated the conflict and ended the opportunity for a peaceful resolution. In addition to the 12 militia members killed, the battle spread a panic throughout the Northwest Territory and Illinois. Blackhawk related in his autobiography, "Never was I so much surprised in this attack. An army of 300 or 400 after learning that we were suing for peace to try to attempt and kill our flag bearers." So after Stillman's Run, and again, this is really condensed. There's so many engagements and back and forth that, in the book I try to give you a guide to finding more of them and digging into it. There are more leaders than just Atkinson and Gaines and, Blackhawk. But I'm just, kind of trying to condense it pretty quickly for you. Atkinson loses the confidence of President Jackson, and Atkinson gets bogged down in what is today Fort Atkinson and Jefferson, Lake Mills. Before the marshes were drained, it was just a quagmire of mosquitoes and water and pools, and there's definitely a lot of sources who think that the Native American tribes are also trying to throw the troops off of Blackhawk's trail, that they were hoping that they would just go away and give up, and that Blackhawk and his band would be able to escape. So by June, President Jackson gives the control of the army to General Winfield Scott. So a young West Point graduate, you might remember that name, Winfield Scott, at the start of the Civil War, is Lincoln's commander-in-chief. He makes the Anaconda Plan, where he's going to cut off the parts of the Confederacy early in the Confederate or the Civil War. But at this point, Winfield Scott is relatively new and very polished. And he sends out, as he gets his forces ready from New York State to come to Chicago and settle this matter in a professional way, he sends a notice to all of his officers and charges them to take care that the rules of war or selected articles be read on the passage to Chicago, and that he positively prohibits, under the highest penalties of law, all mutilating and scalping of prisoners. His orders, he shows a single-handedness, and you can also tell that in his eventual nickname, Old Fuss and Feathers, that Scott was just a taskmaster. However, one of the soldiers who writes back to his father, you remember William Clark from the Lewis and Clark expedition, is now the head of the Indian Affairs in St. Louis. So his son, Lewis Clark, is now a soldier in the U.S. Army, and he writes back to his father, "I only want to get one trophy first, notwithstanding that General Scott has positively prohibited scalping, etc. Yet if I bring a red rascal, I think I'll manage to have his head off before he dies, which will not be mutilating him, you know, and I'll have to cut off his head to kill him. And having his noodle, I can take his scalp with impunity. Give my love to all, your affectionate son, Lewis." So that is the son of the Superintendent of Indian Affairs. So General Winfield Scott, he's bringing the professional army from the east. Atkinson is still searching, not able to find Blackhawk. Henry Dodge, his scouts, and is in the lead regions trying to calm everyone down, and has a couple of really small but very effective battles, so his star really begins to rise. And General Winfield Scott, and a little, takes me back when I was researching this a few years ago, just how struck I was that how something like this could never happen. So General Scott takes a 1,800-mile sea voyage across the Great Lakes to get to Chicago in 18 days, and was a record-breaking time. However, he was unaware that when he left port, cholera had infected the ships. And by putting all of those soldiers in tight quarters on ships was dooming them to an unimaginable sickness. The Niles Weekly Register in early August shares this account as cholera, which is a waterborne bacteria. I can put my mask back on if you want me to. Decimated these troops coming to the Blackhawk War. This is Niles Weekly Register report. Men died in 6 hours after being in perfect health. The steerage was crowded with the dying, and new cases were appearing on the deck when the demon entered the cabin. Sergeant Heil was well at 9 o'clock in the morning, and he was at the bottom of Lake Michigan by 7 o'clock in the afternoon. I had to remove all the sick men to the shore. I had scarcely got through my task when I was thrown down the deck, almost as suddenly as if shot. I felt a sudden rush of blood from my feet upwards, and as it rose, my veins grew cold and my blood curdled. I was seized with nausea at the stomach and a desire to vomit. My legs and hands were cramped with violent pain. The doctor gave me 8 grains of opium and made me rub my legs as fast as I could. He also made me drink a tumbler and a half full of raw brandy and told me if I did not throw up the opium, I would certainly be relieved. A report a couple of weeks later continues in Niles. The deserters were scattered all over the country. Some have died in the woods, and their bodies have been devoured by wolves. The straggling survivors are occasionally seen marching, some of them know not where, with their knapsacks on their backs, shunned by terrified inhabitants as the source of a mortal pestilence. So General Winfield Scott would leave his remaining handful of troops that made it all the way to Chicago, to recuperate, while he and a handful of guides made their way north. The hoped-for discipline and order of Scott's command would not play a role in the Blackhawk War. The fight instead would be settled by the frontiersmen Henry Dodge and General Atkinson. This is one of the articles, right? I think it's July 18. So the tone and tenor of the articles that summer really changed in the Miners' Journal and the Gleanian too, where there were often notices saying tribal members had found lost horses and they would bring them to town. The articles were all about what goods were available and who had letters at the post ready to pick up. But this one was pretty stark, especially for someone in the modern age to read. So you read the last line that victory or death in our watchword be final extermination. It was pretty severe. After the summer goes on, and eventually a couple of Dodge's men do track down Blackhawk. There's a major battle at Wisconsin Heights where they escape over the Wisconsin River, and now, though, Dodge and Atkinson know where the British band is. There's a wild race to the Wisconsin River to try to escape to the other side, but they weren't successful. On the left is it's a painting by Caitlin of Mississippi River bluffs, which gives you some idea of the elevation and the pitch of the hills. The picture on the right is Battle Bluff, probably 2 years ago, right on the day of the battle, August 3rd. So that would have been about 2020. And it's now owned by the DNR. The river in front of it is a park with where Battle Isle is, too, that you can visit, and there's a campground there. But if you're brave, there's no parking on Battle Bluff. There's no facilities. You have to park on a kind of like a culvert, and then you have to walk up it. And it's really that picture doesn't do it justice. I mean, it's very steep, but also beautiful, amazing views. So at the Battle of Bad Axe, the Gleanian reported they actually had their editor, Dr. Addison Fileo, was actually embedded with the U.S. Army, and he took articles and had a couple of accounts of the fighting. So he reported a couple of weeks after, the Indians were driven from our spies from hill to hill and kept up a tolerably brisk firing from every situation commanding the ground. The brigades of Generals Alexander and Posey were marching down the river when they fell in with another part of our enemy's army and killed and routed all that opposed them. Our whole force descended the almost perpendicular bluff and came into a low valley heavily timbered with a large growth of underweeds and grasses. Sloughs and deep ravines, old logs, etc., were so plentiful as to afford every facility for the enemy to make a strong defense. The battle lasted for upwards of 3 hours. About 50 of the enemy's women and children were taken prisoner, and many by accident in the battle were killed. When the Indians were driven to the bank of the Mississippi, some hundreds of men, women, and children plunged into the river and hoped by diving, etc., to escape the bullets of our guns. Very few, however, escaped our sharpshooters. The loss on the side of the enemy can never be exactly ascertained, but according to the best computation, they must have lost and killed upwards of 150. Our lost and killed was around 27. So I will note that on May 10th, 1989, the State of Wisconsin Assembly formally apologized to the First Nation tribal governments of the Sac and Fox Nations. they noted, it's a long proclamation, but they noted, whereas Chief Blackhawk responded to the suffering of his people by leading them back across the Mississippi in 1832 in the hopes of planting their crops and restoring their villages. And whereas there is no indication that Blackhawk had any intent to conduct military operations other than the defense of his people on land he understood to be theirs, and whereas the affair was tragically concluded in 1832 when hundreds of unarmed men, women, and children and elders were killed while crossing the Mississippi at what has become to be known as the Bad Axe Massacre. So, definitely, a very hard story. I did try to gloss over. It was a long summer, a lot of other skirmishes, really throughout the Northwest Territory in Illinois. A lot of, vendettas were carried out. Upwards of 20 hastily constructed forts were built throughout the area to protect settlers, including Fort Atkinson, where you can go today and see a recreation of what it could have looked like. But the real Fort Atkinson, and this is just a representation of all the different sites. The real Fort Atkinson, no one exactly knows where it was. Archaeologists have looked a couple times, but some of these forts were thrown up so quickly just to last for the summer that I don't know if some of them they'll probably never find. I'm just going to point out a few brief areas nearby. The Bad Bluff in LaGrange, Wisconsin is a beautiful site. There's also a nice trail to a glacial erratic, the Stone Elephant. The Battle of Wisconsin Heights is definitely a worthwhile site too. Similar to the Battle of Bad Axe, the DNR has been doing a wonderful job making this site more accessible. It's close to Prairie du Sac and Wollersheim Winery. But they have great trails. They're doing a lot of nature restoration or prairie restoration there. This too, not very close to us, the Jefferson Marsh Wilderness area. If you go on a late July or August day when 90% humidity, I think there's still spots where you can feel that, what it must have been like that summer. And of course, Fort Atkinson, and the more I look, traveling through this great part of the country, there's always, Blackhawk looking out from spots all over. Milton, I should have meant the Horde Museum in Fort Atkinson too. It's a free museum. They have a wonderful Blackhawk room, a lot of great material, very accessible. Of course, the Milton House Museum, they don't have much on the Blackhawk War, but just down the road is Storrs Lake. And then, the Lincoln piece comes in too, that it's hard for people to sometimes conceptualize Abe Lincoln and being tied into this at all. And granted, he was never part of any of the battles. He did two sign-up sessions in the militia, but it was early on in the conflict. And that April was the first political letter he ever wrote to the Sangamon Weekly newspaper. It was 8,400 words. So I checked, and I think the Gazette, their limit is 250 words if you want to write a letter to the editor. So he really went over. And remember, that was when you had to do the typesetting. So some poor typesetter had to, and it's a very interesting, but you could tell he was an ambitious young man. And even this account from his friend George Harrison is rather new. This was just printed, new research about 4 or 5 years ago. Someone found one of Lincoln's secretaries had this untranslated letters from letters he was getting from the public, and a few of them were George Harrison, who served with Lincoln. So here's a great tidbit from from George about life in the wilderness with Lincoln. And I'll, let's see, we're running short on time, so I'm not going to read any more on George. But you know, it is just interesting that I think Lincoln was, even pretty young, was rather politically savvy, in that there's only a couple of brief instances where he mentions that he was in the Blackhawk War. When Zachary Taylor dies, the 12th president, he is in the Whig Party and Lincoln is a Whig. So Lincoln is asked to go and eulogize their president in Chicago. So Lincoln does, and you know, very effusive, you know, for Zachary Taylor, notes that Zachary Taylor was in the Black Hawk War, but Lincoln doesn't say, hey, I was there too. Lincoln, when he visited the Lincoln Tallman House, you know, the wonderful museum here in Janesville, same thing. You can look at the transcripts of those speeches, and you know, it's just amazing that he wouldn't say, yeah, I was here 30 years ago in the militia, and I camped out on the Rock River here and there. You know, you think he would have sprinkled that in. So you know, obviously, you know, you can come to many reasons why, and no one knows. But I'll just share that so near Springfield, Illinois, is a recreation of the city of Sangamon, where on the right is a statue of Lincoln as a surveyor, where they've recreated the whole city, pioneer city of Sangamon, just maybe about 20 miles outside Springfield, Illinois, and they have a great presidential library and museum. And they also have a listing of all the books that were in Lincoln's library. So we know that when Lincoln was practicing law, he had a copy of Benjamin Drake's History of the Black Hawk War, which came out in 1850. So this is, you know, when Lincoln is now, you know, professional, and he has this history that he actually played a role in. And in the opening, the foreword of Drake's history is this little paragraph. Drake says, "We gravely recognize American Indians as an independent people and treat them as vassals. We make solemn compacts with them, which we interpret as our interest dictates, but we punish them if they follow our example. We admit the title to the land which they occupy, and at the same time literally compel them to sell it to us upon our own terms. We make war upon them without any adequate cause, pursue them without mercy, and put them to death without regard to age, sex, or condition, and then deliberately proclaim to the world that they are savages, cruel and untamable, degraded and faithless." So maybe reading that, Lincoln figured, maybe I shouldn't mention that I was part of that. So again, I'll just thank you and say, if you go to my website or blackhawkwar.com, are more resources. And if you have the opportunity, if you go to Amazon or the publisher Arcadia Press, my foreword was written by a member of the Sac-and Meskwaki Nation. That foreword is really, you can read it online without buying the book, and it's very important. This young gentleman, Keelan Hamilton Youngbird, is a young historian and phenom from his community, and that really makes, you know, everything that built off of was really from his, you know, strong opening. And that was it. So thank you so much.
All right, so thank you very much to Ben. That was excellent. And thank you all for being here. I just wanted to remind you, Ben does have books here for sale that after we're done with the Q&A, you can come up and purchase one of his books and have him sign it. Also, for any of you who were planning to come Thursday to the program about Indian boarding schools, unfortunately, it had to be canceled because the speaker had an emergency in her family. So we will reschedule it for some point in the future, but that program for Thursday is canceled. I also wanted to let you know, if you are interested in getting more information about the Allies of Native Nations, there is a sign-in sheet back there. If you just give me your name and email address, I will make sure you get the information. We meet every month on the fourth Tuesday at 6 p.m. And currently we're meeting virtually still. So if you're interested in that, you can sign up. But right now, what we're going to do, you all were so engrossed. No one raised their hand to ask a question, but I know that I do have one person in the back who has a question, so I will let her start. And then if anybody else has a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you.
Years ago, I had heard a story that Chief Blackhawk and his tribe hid out in the Palmer Park area of Janesville, eluding the army. Would that have been before he was captured the first time?
Of looting the I couldn't hear the last part.
Would it be possible that that happened prior to this latest, like before they caught him the first time?
So I guess I don't know. So I don't know exactly what the report was, or you said Elver Park? Palmer Park. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, that time, it was so early, nothing had been platted. There really weren't many, settlers here at all. There were absolutely conflicts between Native American, people and communities with folks coming in. But, and even though the Northwest Territory, Wisconsin, wasn't open for settlement, or, even the lead miners around Dodgeville weren't really supposed to be there. It was really the Illinois border was the farthest that you should really go. So it's possible that there were definitely conflicts. I can't speak to, I don't think I have come across a reference specifically on that. I think there are two. Sure, you can.
Did Blackhawk have any admirers in the white world that he had to fight against?
That he had to fight against? Or
Any admirers in the general population that fought against?
yeah, no, there's definitely reports where he was well regarded even before this happened. People knew that in the War of 1812, in the Battle of Cable Island on the Mississippi, that he was on the side of the British fighting American forces, but that had been a few decades earlier. I don't know if there's, specifically I could name, individuals, but absolutely, and definitely even after the war, in the tours out east, they were just enamored with him. The crowds were huge. There were reports about how Andrew Jackson was mad that his Blackhawks crowds were bigger than the ones he was getting in D.C., and people were trampled and hurt during the rush to get them. And then even the reports of when after the war, he settled on the Des Moines River in Iowa. And the community out there absolutely have really positive stories about how approachable Blackhawk was and open. And usually they talked a lot about his wife, too. So on Rock Island now, when you go to the Hauberg Museum, there's a special area named, I'm sorry, I'm spacing on her name, and how dedicated he was, because he was monogamous. And that wasn't always the tradition, but he absolutely was. So. Oh, sure.
I was just going to share with the group talking about Abraham Lincoln and his horse that was stolen. Recently, a couple weeks back, I was on newspapers.com looking at the Janesville Gazette. And in the early 1960s, the Tallman House had an ice cream social, and part of that activity that the Southern Wisconsin Tourist Bureau had acquired an Arabian thoroughbred that they gave to the state of Illinois in recognition of the horse that Lincoln had lost. I guess we're off the hook.
Yeah, that was very funny. Oh, I think.
I realized Joe Davies County was a lot larger back then. But do you have an approximate idea of the approximate white population in northwest Illinois in the 1830s?
You know, I don't really have the population right here, but I think I would say like Galena, I think was maybe a couple thousand people. But even then, that was a little seasonal, that the miners wouldn't stay through the winter because they didn't have any crops, or everything had to be shipped in while they were in the mine, so no one was producing agriculturally yet. So I would roughly say a couple thousand, because I think in the 1830 census for the whole Northwest Territory, it was like 22,000, but that was Michigan, Iowa, Wisconsin. But I think just in that area. But you can look it up. You just go to census.gov and you can get it quickly.
Yeah,
But
I tried for a while, and then that was yesterday, so now I have something to do tomorrow.
there you go.
And I'll just make a suggestion. At the library, we have librarians who would
Oh, boy.
love to help you find that
Absolutely. What they're there for.
I'm just wondering if because you grew up in this area, is that
Yeah.
what drew your attention to this, or was history
Yeah.
your interest, or what?
No, so it was really just, I think it was really lucky where I ended, having grown up in Dodgeville, and my mom still lives there. And then we moved to Milton and, found that sign that we were just equidistant for me to do these weekend trips with our kids, that we could run down to the Quad Cities and, go to a couple museums and, definitely have pictures of my kids rolling their eyes at me. See, we run to Stillman's Valley, and it's like, what's in Stillman's Valley, Dad? Like, oh, it's really exciting. And it was just, and every time I would learn a little bit more, and there are great histories out there. So, Cecil Eby and Trask, and but it was just making it accessible, that you would see things, but just connecting it all. I just kept accumulating all this stuff. And then it really came down to when I was like, well, let's really do this, reaching out to the 3 Sac and Fox communities. I was kind of gave them my book proposal and reached out to their historic societies and talked to them and, visit each one. I would share what I had and said, I'm coming down there in 2 months. Can we talk? And really that process where it was like, yeah, this is kind of needed, that I think just putting all the pieces together made a lot of sense. And I didn't realize how far, it went out, and every week I'll get an email from someone telling me another piece to the story. I think it really but it was my time as a busboy. I don't know, just you listening to stories from the old timers, and I just feel like this was a really good story that I hadn't told, and wanted to help other people kind of go down that path. So.
Were the tribes very willing to bring you in to?
Yeah, absolutely. So Keelan Youngbird and his family, his dad Joaquin was really open, and Oklahoma. I had never been to Oklahoma before, and very different landscape, but beautiful, and everyone was welcoming, and sharing material, and I shared what I had, and it was just. It was just one of those things where now it's like, well, now I have to do it because people thought it would be good to have, and I think that's how it is. You go to, I'd encourage anyone to go to the Meskwaki settlement in Tama. It's really not that far, and for it to be, continuous since 1857, but that was land they always thought, was theirs. It's just really a neat experience. And I wish I would have gone on a 5th grade trip there. Not that Great America isn't nice, but so.
Hey Ben, can you hear me here? I'm not
Yeah.
sure this is working. I think it's time for a commercial. I think you did a good job cataloging all those sites and all
Oh,
the
thanks.
coordinates on that. My goodness, and a lot of digits
Yeah.
there. I'm interested in the comment about trembling lands. I think that's the
Yeah.
dismal swamp up there.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, there's so many great tidbits that I can't get everything into, a talk. So the trembling lands, and, poor Henry Atkinson, he, just his reports back of trying to move an army through this marshy area that is from, here on the Rock River, really up to Lake Mills. But it was just a mess. No roads, not many good, it's not like a western part of Wisconsin where you have more landmarks. You can say, there's Blue Mounds or there's Platte Mound. And it was just getting eaten up. People were miserable. I think the Ho-Chunk Winnebago, he was probably getting bad advice from a lot of people on, oh yeah, look over here for Blackhawk, or where, really a lot of, people didn't want him to be found. And I'd say even people, and it gets so complicated because, there had been French settlers here throughout the 17 and 1800s, and their way of life was changing too. And some of these communities they built were being overrun with this new influx of Americans. So it was just, I appreciate the comment on the points, and it was really, every time I went somewhere, there'd be 5 new places, and I'd have to look and see who made this statue, and like which is the first, and how to get here, and what didn't used to be there. And but it is, in this neck of the woods, it really is all over the place. So I hope it's a use to people. And I hope somewhere down the road someone builds upon it and runs with it in a different direction. So.
With respect to Chief Blackhawk, do you know when he died, where he died, and how he died?
Yeah. So he died, and again, so he wasn't, you probably wouldn't call him a chief. He was definitely a war leader, but he wasn't a sort of lineage-based hereditary chief, but definitely renowned for his exploits earlier in his life. So he, after the war, what was it, 60, I can look, I think it's 67, so on the Des Moines River, a really beautiful part of Iowa. And Iowa definitely is beautiful, but I thought this part of Iowa was really beautiful. So a little bit south of the Quad Cities, and then out to the west. And the stories I read is that he was pretty well embraced by the community. He had a little spot, his little home overlooking the river that he could look out on. And there is, the sad story when he passes away. Let's see, 1838 on October 3rd. That then his family builds sort of a cairn, sort of like a wooden structure with his body seated in this with a flag right on the land he had there overlooking the river. And then the story gets harder, and there's conflicting about whether his head was stolen, his head and his whole body, or all at once. And then it really gets, where did it end up? The main account people think is that the Iowa Historical Society eventually retrieved his bones, but then their main history museum burnt up in like the 1880s. So there is a small plaque in the cemetery on the Des Moines River, but even that is miles away from where his home was and where he was first interred. But if I can go back quick, when you go to the Quad Cities, the Hauberg Museum has a life mask. I should have mentioned that bronze there on the left is taken from a life mask of his probably 2 or 3 years before he died. So that's probably definitely more than the statue on the right, which was the first statue of him in like 1897 or something. other than, Caitlin's paintings, that's probably even more accurate of a representation of him in his last couple of final years.
And how old was he?
I think like late 60s by then.
Are there any other questions? All right. Well, if not, thank
Great.
you all so much, and thank you again, Ben, for
Yeah,
being
thank
here.
you.